The desert looked endless, a stretch of pale sand and scattered rock under a sky that burned white. Heat rippled through the air. Evelyn Hart walked with her head down, one arm hanging useless at her side, the other holding what was left of a canteen. It was empty, but she kept lifting it anyway, hoping a few drops might fall. Her tongue felt like leather. Her lips had split from dryness. Each step hurt. Her boots had rubbed her heels raw days ago, and every grain of sand that got inside them made it worse. She tried to stay upright, but her knees shook. Her dress, once clean and blue, was now brown with dust and torn at the hem. She could feel sweat drying on her skin, leaving her sticky and weak. She didn't remember how many miles she had walked since she ran. The men who'd left her for dead might still be behind her, or maybe they had decided the desert would finish what they started. Either way, she couldn't go back. When she finally stopped, her legs gave out. She dropped to her knees, breathing hard, the sound rough and shallow. Her eyes burned from the sun, and the horizon blurred into a moving line of heat. She thought she saw a shape, something tall, dark, and steady in the distance. It looked like a man on horseback, but the air shimmered too much to be sure. Evelyn pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to focus. Her first thought was fear. Men on horses never meant safety anymore. Her second thought was disbelief. Nobody rode this far from the towns without a reason. The sound came next, slow, rhythmic hoofbeats. Real. Getting closer. Her pulse sped up. She tried to stand, but her legs didn't want to work. She forced herself anyway, wiping dust from her eyes with the back of her hand. The rider drew near, a man in a brown leather vest, dark trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. A rifle was strapped to his saddle. His horse was gray and sweating, its sides heaving from the ride. He stopped a few yards away. Neither spoke for a long moment. Evelyn felt her heartbeat pounding in her chest and wondered if he could hear it. The man looked down at her, calm and alert, like someone used to measuring danger before speaking. "You look like you've been out here too long," he said, voice deep but steady. Evelyn's throat hurt when she tried to answer. "Water," she said, barely a whisper. He swung off the horse and reached into his saddlebag. When he handed her his canteen, she hesitated for half a second, old habits of mistrust dying slow, then took it. The water was warm, but it felt like life itself. She drank in slow swallows, trying not to cough. When she handed it back, she could finally meet his eyes. They were gray, lined from years of sun and worry. He didn't smile, didn't soften, but there was something steady there, something that felt safe, even if she didn't trust it yet. "What's your name?" he asked. "Evelyn," she said. "Hart." He nodded once. "Cole Maddox." He glanced toward the horizon, scanning for movement. "You alone?" Evelyn hesitated. Her stomach tightened. Not by choice. He didn't ask anything else. He studied her for a moment, then took her arm gently, steadying her as she swayed on her feet. "There's shade a few miles east," he said. "You'll make it if you move slow." "I can walk," she said, pulling her arm free. He didn't argue. He only turned, guiding the horse alongside her. The silence between them stretched, broken only by wind and the clop of hooves. After a while, her legs started to give out again. She stumbled once, then again. Cole caught her before she fell, his hands firm under her arms. She could smell the dust and leather on him, and for a moment, her fear faded into simple exhaustion. "Up," he said quietly, helping her onto the horse. She didn't resist this time. As the horse moved, she rested her hands against the saddle horn, eyes half closed, the rhythm of the ride pulling her somewhere between waking and sleep. Cole walked beside the horse, leading it through the heat. He didn't look back at her, but he slowed his pace each time she swayed. Evelyn watched him from above, trying to decide if she could trust a man like this, strong, quiet, unreadable. Her gut said no. But right now, trust wasn't a choice. By the time the sun dropped behind the hills, she couldn't tell where she ended and the dust began. The world tilted and went dark just as Cole's voice cut through the blur. "You're safe for now. Stay awake." She tried, but the world slipped away before she could answer. The sun was dropping fast, pulling long shadows across the sand when Ethan spotted movement ahead. At first, he thought it was just the heat playing tricks again, one of those mirages that dance and disappear as soon as you blink. But as he squinted, he realized the shape wasn't fading. It was a person. He urged his horse forward, his pulse rising. The closer he got, the clearer it became. A woman, lying halfway on her side, one arm stretched toward a patch of dry brush like she'd been crawling for it. Her clothes were torn, dust clinging to every inch of her skin. "Hey!" he shouted, sliding off his horse and jogging the last few feet. No answer. Just a faint movement of her fingers. He knelt beside her. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her skin burned hot under the touch of his glove. She wasn't dead, but she was close. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He'd seen dehydration before. Out here, it could take a person in hours. He grabbed his canteen, tilted it slightly, and let a few drops touch her lips. She flinched, then opened her mouth weakly. "Easy," he said, voice steady but urgent. "Small sips." She swallowed the water like it was the only thing keeping her alive. After a few seconds, her eyes fluttered open, hazy, unfocused, then locking on him. Fear flickered there first, then confusion. "Don't move," he said, holding up a hand. "You're safe now. Just breathe." She tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. He leaned closer, catching pieces of broken words. "They left me." Ethan frowned. "They?" That meant she hadn't been out here alone. He scanned the horizon, hand instinctively moving to his revolver. Nothing but sand, rock, and the wind. "Who left you?" he asked, but she'd already slipped back into half-consciousness. He exhaled, kneeling back. His mind started running through options. He couldn't leave her, not like this. His horse could carry them both, but they'd have to move slow. The nearest town was at least 15 miles out. If she didn't get shade and more water soon, she wouldn't make it. He took a quick look through her torn satchel. No food, no flask, nothing useful. Whoever she'd been with hadn't just left her, they'd stripped her of everything. Anger stirred under his ribs, sharp and unwelcome. He didn't even know her name, but the thought of someone doing this, just abandoning her, made his jaw tighten. He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a worn blanket and wrapping it around her shoulders. Then, carefully, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp against his chest. As he placed her gently across the horse's saddle, her head rolled to the side. For a moment, she opened her eyes again, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't leave me." "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan said quietly, tightening the reins. "You're coming with me." He mounted behind her, one arm steadying her as the horse started moving toward the horizon. Each step sent up little clouds of sand, catching the orange light of the setting sun. Ethan kept his eyes ahead, but his thoughts kept circling back to her, who she was, what had happened, and whether she'd even survive the night. He didn't usually take in strays. He'd learned the hard way that helping people out here could get you killed. But as her head rested weakly against his chest, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. The desert stretched endlessly before them, silent except for the slow rhythm of hooves. And somewhere in that silence, a faint, uneasy thought settled in his mind. Whoever left her out here might still be close. By the time Ethan saw the outline of the abandoned cabin, the sun had already vanished behind the hills. The air had turned cold fast, the kind that sank into your bones after a long day in the heat. His horse was breathing hard, and the woman in his arms hadn't made a sound in over an hour. He slowed down and studied the cabin from a distance. The roof was half collapsed, one wall leaning forward, but it was still standing, and more importantly, it meant shelter. He scanned the area. No smoke, no tracks, no sign of movement. It looked safe enough. "Hang on," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. He dismounted carefully, boots sinking into the soft dirt, and lifted her from the saddle. Her body felt even lighter now, like she'd lost weight in just the few hours he'd carried her. Her skin was cool to the touch. He felt a jolt of panic. He'd seen people fade fast before, but he wasn't ready to watch it happen again. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. A broken chair, a half-rotted table, and the remains of a fireplace filled with ash. He laid her down on a blanket near the hearth and took a step back, thinking fast. He needed a fire. He needed to get her warm. He tore apart what was left of the chair, breaking off the driest pieces, and struck a match. The small flame caught, flickering weakly before spreading. The firelight threw shaky orange light across the room, revealing her face more clearly. She was young, maybe late 20s. Dirt streaked her cheekbones, her lips cracked, her hair tangled with sand. There were bruises, small ones on her wrists and along her collarbone. Ethan froze for a second, his jaw tightening. Those weren't from a fall. He sat back on his heels, staring at her, trying to understand what kind of person left someone like this in the middle of nowhere. The kind that didn't deserve to be breathing, he thought. He reached for his canteen again and lifted her head slightly. "Come on," he murmured. "Just a little." This time, she drank more steadily, her throat moving as she swallowed. He watched closely, relief creeping in. After a few moments, her eyes opened again, slowly adjusting to the light. She looked around, then at him. Confusion mixed with fear in her expression. "You're safe," he said, keeping his tone low, even. "You passed out in the desert. I brought you here." She stared at him for a long time, trying to piece together his words. "Where are we?" "An old cabin, few miles from Clearwater," he said. "You've been out for hours." She tried to sit up, but her body gave out almost immediately. He caught her by the shoulders before she fell back. Her skin was cold and damp with sweat. "Easy," he said. "You need to rest." She looked away, eyes unfocused, voice trembling. "They took everything." Ethan's brows drew together. "Who?" She didn't answer right away. Her breathing quickened. He saw her jaw tighten, saw the tears forming before she blinked them away. "We were traveling, a small group. They said they'd help me reach town. But after 2 days, we ran out of water. Her voice cracked. "They left me." Ethan clenched his hands, forcing himself to stay calm. It wasn't the first time he'd heard a story like that out here. Desperation made people cruel. Still, something about the way she said it, quiet, flat, like she'd already accepted it, hit harder than he expected. "You're lucky I found you," he said finally. She gave a weak, bitter smile. "Or unlucky. Depends on who you are." He almost smiled back, but didn't. "Name's Ethan," he said. She hesitated before answering. "Clara." He nodded, standing to check the fire. "You should sleep, Clara. We'll ride out at dawn. There's a doctor in Clearwater who can help you." She watched him move across the room, her eyes heavy but still alert. "Why help me?" He didn't answer right away. He thought about the bodies he'd seen over the years, left in ditches or half buried in sand, people no one came back for. He'd told himself long ago not to get involved, that it wasn't his job to save anyone. But tonight, looking at her, that promise didn't mean much. "Because someone should have," he said finally. She didn't say anything back. Her eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion taking over. Ethan sat down near the door, revolver resting in his hand, and stared into the fire. The wind outside whistled through the broken boards. He should have felt relief. They'd made it, she was alive, but something kept his nerves tight. The bruises, the missing supplies, the way she'd said whoever those men were, they might not be far behind. He checked the revolver again, rolled his shoulders, and forced himself to stay awake. Outside, the desert was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that meant peace. It was the kind that waited. The fire had burned down to a dim orange glow by the time Ethan realized how cold it had gotten. The wind outside pressed against the walls, making the old cabin creak and shift like something alive. Every few minutes, the sound of the door latch rattling made him look up, hand already on his revolver. Clara slept by the fire, wrapped in a worn blanket he'd found in the corner. Her breathing was steady now, slower, calmer than before. Her face had color again. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He should have felt at ease, but the back of his neck still prickled with unease. He'd learned long ago that quiet didn't always mean safety. He sat near the window, watching the darkness. The moonlight made the desert look empty and endless, but he knew that was only half the truth. People could move fast and silent when they wanted to. Outlaws didn't leave unfinished business behind, especially the kind who left a woman for dead. He rubbed his eyes, trying to stay awake. He'd been on the trail for 2 days before he found her, and his body was begging for rest. But he couldn't risk it. He'd already dragged one half-dead stranger across the desert. He wasn't about to let her get killed now. Behind him, Clara shifted in her sleep. A small sound escaped her throat, a muffled cry, barely a word. Ethan turned, saw her face twist in fear. He stood and crouched beside her, speaking low. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You're safe." She didn't wake at first. Her hand clenched around the edge of the blanket, knuckles white. "Please," she whispered, still trapped somewhere in the dream. He hesitated, then reached out and touched her shoulder gently. "Clara!" Her eyes snapped open. She gasped, sitting up fast, breathing hard. For a second, she didn't seem to know where she was. Her gaze darted from the walls to him, wide and unfocused. "Hey," he said softly. "It's me. You're fine. Just a dream." Her breathing slowed, bit by bit. She nodded, pressing her hand against her chest like she was steadying herself. "Sorry," she said finally, her voice rough. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." He leaned back, still watching her. "Nightmares." She gave a short laugh, tired and hollow. "Guess my mind doesn't like rest any more than my body does." Ethan didn't answer. He understood that feeling all too well. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the dying fire and the faint whistle of wind through the cracks in the wall. Then Clara said quietly, "You shouldn't stay here long." He turned his head toward her. "You think they'll come looking?" "I know they will." She rubbed her arms, eyes distant. "They think I have something. I don't. But that doesn't matter now." "What did they want?" She hesitated. "Money. Trust. Doesn't matter which." Her voice dropped. "There were 3 of them. Klain, Morrow, and a man named Harris. Klain was the one who said they'd take me to Clearwater. Harris was the one who changed his mind." She paused, jaw tightening. He didn't like being told no. Ethan's expression didn't change much, but his shoulders stiffened. He'd heard that kind of story before. Men who saw desperation as an opportunity. "They left you out there to die." She nodded once. "After they were done." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, the firelight flickering across his face. He wanted to ask more, but he could see she was barely holding herself together. Instead, he just said, "Then they'll come back. Men like that don't leave loose ends." She met his eyes. "You could leave me here. Save yourself the trouble." He shook his head. "Not happening." Clara frowned slightly, studying him. "Why? You don't know me." He leaned back, picking up a piece of wood to stoke the fire. "Don't need to," he said simply. "I saw what they did. That's enough." Her eyes softened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around herself and watched the flames climb higher again. After a while, she spoke again, quietly. "Thank you." Ethan nodded once, still facing the fire. "Get some sleep. We ride at dawn." Clara lay back down, her breathing steadying once more. Ethan stayed where he was, revolver across his thigh, eyes fixed on the door. He thought about what she'd said, the names, the way her voice shook when she said after they were done. Rage burned low in his stomach, not the kind that shouted, but the kind that built slowly, waiting for a reason to move. Outside, a coyote howled somewhere in the distance. Ethan's grip tightened on the revolver. He listened carefully, every nerve awake, until the night settled again into its uneasy silence. The fire popped, throwing a spark across the floor. He glanced at Clara one last time, her face calm now, finally resting, and turned back toward the window. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was already clear. If those men were still out there, he wasn't running. The first light of dawn came slow, dull, and gray, spreading across the horizon like a warning more than a promise. The cabin was colder than it had been the night before, and the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. Ethan was already awake, sitting by the fire's last embers, his hat pulled low. He hadn't slept. Every creak in the wood, every shift of wind had kept him on edge. Clara stirred under the blanket. Her hair was a mess of knots and dust, and when she sat up, she winced at the stiffness in her shoulders. She caught him looking and straightened her posture, trying to hide the exhaustion in her face. "Morning," she said quietly. "Sun's up," Ethan replied. "We move fast. Clearwater's 2 days out, maybe less if we cut through the ridge." She nodded, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Her palms were blistered, small red marks showing through the dirt. She saw him glance at them and pulled her hands back into her lap. "I can ride," she said, more defensive than confident. "I didn't say you couldn't." Ethan stood, rolling his shoulders and stretching his arms before stepping outside. The cold air bit at his face, waking him up better than any coffee could. His horse, Dust, was tied under a low tree. The animal lifted its head when it saw him, snorting softly. Ethan ran a hand along its neck and checked the saddle straps. Everything was in place. He'd packed what little they had, some jerky, 2 canteens of water, and a box of ammunition he'd kept from an old job. When Clara came outside, the sunlight caught her face. She looked pale but determined. Her dress was torn at the hem, one boot half coming apart, but she didn't complain. She took one long look at the desert stretching ahead of them. "Feels longer when you're staring at it," she said. "It is." Ethan mounted his horse, then reached down a hand for her. She hesitated only a second before taking it. Her hand felt small, fragile against his. When she settled behind him, she tried to keep her distance at first, holding onto the saddle horn. But as the horse started moving, the uneven ground forced her closer. Ethan felt the tension in her grip, tight, unsure, like she was fighting her own instincts. They rode in silence for most of the morning. The desert was quiet except for the sound of hooves and wind. Every now and then, Ethan glanced back over his shoulder. He didn't see anything, but something in his gut told him they weren't alone. He'd spent too many years tracking men to ignore that feeling. Around midday, they stopped by a dry creek bed. Clara climbed down stiffly, stretching her legs. She bent to fill the canteen, but Ethan caught her wrist. "Don't," he said. "That water's been sitting. You'll be worse off if you drink it." She frowned but stepped back, watching him pull out what was left in their clean supply. He handed her the canteen, then took a slow sip himself before scanning the horizon again. "Something wrong?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. He squinted into the glare of the sun, eyes tracing the far ridge. "You see that dust cloud?" Clara shaded her eyes. "Could be the wind." "Could be," he said quietly, but he didn't sound convinced. They ate in silence. The jerky was dry and tough, and Clara had to chew slowly just to get it down. When she looked up again, Ethan was already back in the saddle, scanning the horizon. His jaw was tight, shoulders set. "Are they coming?" she asked finally. "I don't know," he said. "But if they are, we'll know soon enough." She didn't argue. She just climbed up behind him again. By late afternoon, the sun was high, and the wind had shifted. The sound of distant hooves reached them first, faint, rhythmic, and steady. Ethan pulled his horse to a stop, listening. Clara's hands tightened on his sides. "They're following," she said quietly. "Yeah," Ethan replied, already turning the horse toward the ridge. "3 riders, maybe 4. We'll keep low." They rode hard for nearly an hour, cutting through dry brush and rocky paths. Clara held on tighter, her cheek pressed against his back, her heartbeat wild. She didn't speak, but Ethan could feel her fear through every tense breath. When they reached a narrow ravine, Ethan stopped. The horse was breathing heavy, foam at its mouth. He slid down, scanning the trail behind them. Dust rose again in the distance. They didn't have long. "There's a dry cave up that slope," he said, pointing to a dark opening halfway up the ridge. "We wait there until night." Clara nodded, her legs shaking when she dismounted. They climbed quickly, the rocks shifting under their boots. Inside the cave, it was cooler, the air heavy with stillness. Ethan crouched near the entrance, pulling out his rifle. Clara sat behind him, trying to catch her breath. Sweat ran down her neck. Her dress stuck to her skin, and she pushed her hair out of her face, whispering, "How long do you think we have?" "Not long." He watched the riders appear, 3 men, just as he'd guessed. One of them wore a wide black hat. Even from this distance, Ethan could tell he was the kind of man who liked being in charge. They slowed near the creek bed, scanning the tracks. Clara saw them too. Her throat tightened. She whispered, "That's Harris." Ethan didn't take his eyes off them. "The one in black." She nodded. "He's the one who left me." Ethan's jaw clenched. His grip on the rifle tightened. He breathed out slow through his nose, forcing the anger down. "Then he's the one we keep an eye on." They waited, both silent. The sound of the riders faded gradually as they moved down the trail. For the first time in hours, Clara let out a breath. She sat back, wiping her palms on her skirt. Ethan turned his head slightly toward her. "You all right?" She looked at him for a moment, eyes wide and unsteady. "You should have left me," she said. "Not my way," he replied. She stared at him, like she was trying to understand what kind of man said something like that. "Why?" she asked quietly. He paused, checking the chamber of his rifle. "Because I've seen what happens when nobody helps." That answer stayed with her. She didn't know what it meant exactly, but she knew it came from somewhere deep, somewhere that hurt. As the light faded outside the cave, Ethan finally lowered his rifle. "We move again when it's dark," he said. "They'll keep following, but they'll lose the trail for a while." Clara nodded. Her fear hadn't left, but something else had started to take its place, a thin thread of trust she hadn't planned to give. When the first stars appeared outside, the two of them sat side by side in silence. Neither spoke. The danger was still close, but for now there was a fragile peace between them, built not on comfort, but on survival. The desert at night was colder than Clara remembered. The air cut through her thin dress and made her shiver, even as she tried to keep up with Ethan's pace. The moon hung low, barely enough light to see the uneven path ahead. The sound of the horses' hooves was steady, cautious, and muffled by the sand. They had left the cave hours ago, waiting until the riders below were just dark shapes against the horizon. Ethan hadn't said much since then. His eyes stayed fixed on the trail, his body alert but calm. Clara watched the way he moved, how deliberate everything was, how he seemed to trust his instincts more than his sight. When they reached a ridge overlooking the dry valley, Ethan pulled the horse to a stop. "We'll cut through there," he said, pointing toward a faint shimmer in the distance. "There's a river about an hour ahead. If we're lucky, we can lose them at the crossing." Clara nodded, her voice low. "You really think they'll stop chasing?" Ethan glanced back at her. "No. But they'll slow down once they lose the trail. That's all we need." They moved again. The trail grew rougher, scattered with rocks and dead brush. Clara tried to stay balanced behind him, but every jolt sent pain up her legs. She bit her lip to keep quiet. She didn't want to sound weak. Not after everything he'd done for her. After a while, Ethan slowed the horse and dismounted. "We go on foot from here," he said. "Too loud on the rocks." She climbed down, her knees unsteady. He led the horse by the reins, and they walked in silence for a long stretch. The night sounds felt closer now, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of insects, the quiet hum of the wind. Clara tried to keep her breathing steady. She was tired, thirsty, and scared, but she wasn't ready to give up. She looked at Ethan's back as he walked ahead. His silhouette looked carved into the darkness, solid, unyielding. She wondered if he was ever afraid. When they finally reached the riverbank, the air grew cooler. The faint sound of running water was a relief. Ethan stopped near a cluster of low rocks and crouched. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said. Clara sank to the ground, her legs trembling. She dipped her hand into the water, the cold burning her skin at first. Then she drank, slow and careful. Ethan refilled the canteen, his movements quiet and efficient. She watched him in the dim light. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. The exhaustion was there, even if he tried to hide it. "You should rest too," she said. He shook his head. "Not yet." He scanned the trail behind them again, eyes narrowing. "They're too close." "How do you know?" "Because they don't give up. Men like that don't walk away from unfinished work." He paused, then looked at her. "You told me they wanted something you didn't have. You sure that's all?" Clara met his eyes. "Yes. Whatever they think I took, it's not true. But they don't care about truth. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. Then we'll make sure they don't find you. The sound of hooves cut through the night before she could respond. Faint at first, then growing. Ethan's expression hardened. He motioned for her to move behind the rocks. Stay low, he whispered. Clara crouched down, her hands shaking. Ethan pulled his rifle from its holster and took position near the edge of the bank. The moonlight caught the edge of his revolver, the metal dull but ready. The riders appeared minutes later, 3 of them, just as before. They stopped at the river's edge, horses snorting, heads turning as the men scanned the darkness. Clara recognized one of them instantly. Harris. The same black hat, the same way he sat his horse like he owned the ground under it. Her stomach tightened, and her breath caught. Ethan glanced back at her, saw the change in her face, and understood. He's the one. She nodded, barely. Yes. Ethan looked back toward the men. Then he's mine. Harris dismounted first. He walked to the water's edge, crouched, and looked down. Fresh prints, he said to the others. They're close. His voice carried easily in the still air. The other 2 men split up, one moving upriver, one down. Harris stayed in the middle, scanning the brush. You hear me, girl, he called out suddenly. Ain't no use hidin'. You know how this ends. Clara flinched at the sound of his voice. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. He waited until Harris stepped a few feet closer, then raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed off the rocks. One of the men's horses reared, throwing its rider. Harris dove for cover behind a log, shouting orders. The quiet night was gone, replaced by chaos. Clara pressed her hands to her ears, heart pounding. Ethan fired again, this time hitting one of the riders in the leg. The man fell, cursing. The other scrambled for his gun, returning fire wildly. Bullets tore through brush, splintering wood near where Clara hid. Ethan ducked low, eyes sharp, breathing steady. He waited for a break in the gunfire, then called out, You can ride off now and live, or you can stay and die where you stand. Harris laughed, the sound sharp and mean. You think I scare that easy, bounty man? Ethan didn't answer. He waited. The pause stretched long enough that even the wind seemed to stop. Then Harris stepped out, gun in hand, aiming low. Ethan fired first. The bullet struck Harris's shoulder, spinning him backward. The last man ran. His horse bolted down the trail, kicking up sand. The fight was over in seconds. The only sound left was Harris's ragged breathing. Ethan walked down the slope, gun still raised. Harris tried to lift his weapon, but Ethan kicked it away and stood over him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Clara came down slowly, her knees shaking. She stopped a few feet away, watching. Harris looked up at her, face pale. You could have stayed quiet, he muttered. You should have stayed dead. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Clara. You want me to finish it? She stared at Harris, her lips trembling. No, she said finally. He's not worth it. Ethan nodded once. Then we leave him. They turned and walked back to the horse. Clara didn't look back. Her legs were weak, and her chest hurt from holding her breath so long. Ethan helped her into the saddle, then climbed up behind her. As they started riding again, the river faded behind them. Neither spoke for a while. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy, full of things neither was ready to say. Clara leaned slightly against him, just enough to feel the warmth through his shirt. She didn't know if it was exhaustion or trust that made her do it, but Ethan didn't pull away. His hand rested lightly on her hip, steadying her as the horse moved through the night. For the first time since he'd found her, she felt something close to safety. Not comfort, not peace, just the sense that, for now, they'd survived. And that was enough. The morning was quiet, almost too quiet. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, spreading a pale light over the desert plain. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the air was still cool. Ethan was already awake, sitting by the fire, cleaning his revolver with slow, careful movements. His eyes kept drifting toward Clara, who still slept under the worn blanket he'd given her. Her breathing was shallow but steady. He tried to focus on the metal in his hands, on the steady rhythm of the cleaning cloth against the barrel, but his mind wouldn't settle. Something felt off. The silence wasn't right. No wind, no birds, no sound of distant cattle or coyotes. Just empty air. His instincts, sharpened by years of surviving the unpredictable, told him they weren't alone. He holstered his gun and stood, scanning the horizon. His horse flicked its ears nervously, catching something he hadn't yet seen. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Someone's out there," he muttered to himself. Behind him, Clara stirred. She blinked, still half asleep, her hair tangled and cheeks pale. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Stay low," he said quietly, his tone calm but firm. "And don't make a sound." She immediately tensed. The way he spoke left no room for questions. She followed his instructions, crouching near the wagon wheel, eyes wide as she watched him move. Ethan walked slowly toward a small rise nearby, his boots silent on the dirt. He crouched behind a rock and looked out across the desert. In the distance, faint shapes moved against the sunlight, 3 riders, maybe 4. They weren't traveling, they were circling, watching. Ethan's mind went through possibilities fast. Could be bounty hunters, could be outlaws. Either way, they were trouble. He felt the familiar tension in his chest, not fear, exactly, but a sharpened awareness. He wasn't alone anymore, and that made everything more complicated. He went back to Clara, keeping his voice low. "We've got riders coming in from the east. Could be nothing, but I doubt it. We need to move." Her hands trembled as she packed what little they had. "Who are they?" "Don't know. Don't plan to find out if I can help it." He loaded supplies onto the horse quickly, checking the cinch and making sure the rifle was within easy reach. Clara hesitated before climbing up. Her legs were weak, and her eyes darted to the horizon where dust now rose in the distance. Ethan offered his hand, steady and strong. "You'll be fine. Just hold on." As they started riding north, the wind picked up, carrying faint voices behind them, laughter, distant but clear. Ethan looked back once. The riders had seen them. "Hold tight," he said. "We're not stopping." Clara gripped his coat as the horse picked up speed. The desert blurred around them, dry brush, rocks, flashes of sun, but all she could hear was the pounding of hooves and the rush of her own heartbeat. Ethan's thoughts stayed sharp. He knew they couldn't outrun horses for long in open terrain. He needed cover, something to even the odds. He remembered a canyon not far ahead, one with a narrow pass. If they could make it there, they might disappear for a while. "Almost there," he said, voice steady even as his pulse raced. Behind them, the riders were closing in. Clara could hear their shouts now, rough and mean. She didn't dare look back. Ethan's jaw was tight, his eyes focused on the line of rocks ahead. They reached the canyon just as the first gunshot cracked through the air. Clara gasped, ducking instinctively. Ethan didn't flinch. He urged the horse forward, deeper into the pass. The sound of gunfire echoed against the canyon walls, but they kept moving until the noise faded behind them. When they finally stopped, both were breathing hard. Dust clung to their clothes, and Clara's face was streaked with sweat. Ethan listened for a long moment. No voices, no hooves. Just wind. "Are they gone?" she asked quietly. "For now," he said, looking back the way they came. "But they'll be back. Men like that don't give up easy." Clara's fear turned into something else. Frustration, confusion, and a quiet question she'd been holding in since the day he found her. "Why are they after you?" Ethan looked at her for a long time. His expression didn't change, but there was something heavy in his eyes. "Because I've made enemies," he said finally. "And some of them don't like seeing me alive." Clara's hands trembled slightly, but she nodded. She didn't ask more. She just looked at him, the calm way he stood, the way he always seemed in control, even when the world was closing in. And for the first time, she realized that staying with him might be as dangerous as being alone. But when she looked at the canyon walls around them, she also knew she didn't have a choice anymore. The sun had dropped behind the canyon walls, leaving a faint orange glow across the rocks. The air turned cooler, the kind of chill that sank deep after a long day under the sun. Ethan led the horse along the narrow path, scanning the ground for a spot flat enough to make camp. His eyes moved constantly, edges of cliffs, dark crevices, anywhere a man could hide. Clara followed close, her steps careful and uneven. She was exhausted. Her legs trembled from hours of riding and fear. The silence pressed on her ears until the sound of her own breathing felt too loud. She didn't want to slow him down, but her body was reaching its limit. "Here," Ethan said finally. He stopped near a rock ledge where the ground widened into a small flat space, half sheltered by the canyon wall. He tied the horse to a dry branch sticking from the stone and checked the saddlebags. "We'll rest here till morning." Clara nodded without speaking. Her throat was dry, and her mind still replayed the sound of gunfire from earlier. She sat down slowly, her back against the cool rock. Ethan crouched by the fire pit and began gathering small pieces of dry brush. His movements were practiced and quiet. When the first sparks caught, he leaned back, watching the flames build just enough to give light, but not enough to draw attention. "You should eat something," he said, pulling a piece of dried meat from the pack and handing it to her. She took it but stared at it for a while before biting. Her hands shook slightly. "You think they'll find us?" she asked. He glanced at the canyon's dark entrance, where shadows stretched long and deep. "Not tonight. We've put enough distance between us. But they'll keep looking." There was no fear in his voice, just certainty. That steadiness made her chest tighten in a strange way, part safety, part worry. She studied him in the firelight, the scar on his cheek, the dust on his jaw, the way his eyes kept scanning the dark even while he sat still. "You've done this before," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Done what? Run. Hide. Fight." He didn't answer for a moment. The firelight flickered across his face. "Yeah," he said finally. "More times than I'd like." Clara pulled her knees close. "And they're after you because of something you did?" Ethan's jaw tightened, not in anger but in thought. He poked the fire with a stick, watching the embers shift. "Let's just say I made choices that didn't sit right with the kind of men who think they own everything." She didn't press him further. There was a line she felt she shouldn't cross yet. The silence between them grew heavier, filled only by the faint crackle of fire. After a while, Ethan stood and took a slow walk toward the canyon mouth. His boots scraped softly against the gravel. Clara watched him disappear into the shadows and felt a quick stab of fear. He returned a few minutes later, calmer. "No tracks nearby," he said, settling back down. "We're good for now." She nodded, feeling a mix of relief and unease. Her body was tired, but her mind wouldn't let her rest. She looked at him again, wondering what kind of life turned a man into someone who could stay this calm after nearly being shot. Ethan noticed her watching him. "You should try to sleep," he said. "I can't," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear the horses. The shots." He shifted closer, not touching her, but his presence alone seemed to make the cold fade a little. "You're safe now," he said. His voice was steady, low. "I'll keep watch." Something in the way he said it made her believe him. Still, she hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, thinking. "Because you didn't deserve to be left out there," he said finally. "Nobody does." She felt her throat tighten. There was more to it, she could tell by the weight in his voice, but she didn't push. The silence between them softened, no longer heavy but something closer to trust. After a while, Clara shifted closer to the fire, resting her head against the rock. Her eyes began to close. Ethan stayed awake, listening to every sound, the whisper of wind through stone, the faint rustle of the horse. His gun rested near his knee. When he glanced toward Clara, she was asleep, her face calm for the first time since he'd found her. He exhaled slowly. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. And that thought carried more weight than he expected. He stayed like that until the fire burned low, the desert sky black and still. He didn't sleep. He didn't trust the quiet. But as he watched her rest, he felt something unfamiliar, something he didn't want to name yet.